Welcome, everyone. We're letting folks into the webinar, so we're going to get started in just about a minute or two. Thanks so much. All right, everyone, bienvenidos, welcome. My name is Victoria DeFrancesco Soto, and I am the Assistant Dean of Civic Engagement here at the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Tonight is our last part of the LBJ Latino lecture series that we kicked off earlier this year, where we started looking at the 2020 election, the Latino electorate, essentially a post-mortem of what we saw with Latinos nationwide, and then earlier this month, taking a deep dive into Texas. But what we're going to do today, and the way we're going to close off this series, is literally zooming out. We use this word a lot nowadays, but pulling back and looking at the big picture demographic landscape of Latinos and immigrants more broadly. There have been a number of important changes, patterns in growth, patterns in settlement that we're going to dive into today in our discussion. And also, as a result of the tragic events in Georgia last week, we've also decided to dig in and understand a little bit better the growth and the change and the evolution of the Asian American population in this country, all of course within a lens of the COVID crisis pandemic. And in order to do that, I have with me the nation's foremost expert in this, the Pew Center's Dr. Mark Hugo Lopez, who is the, let me get this title right, it's a long and fancy title, the Director of Global Migration and Demography Research at the Pew Research Center. However, Mark will be getting a new title very soon and taking on a new leadership role at the Pew Center, doing some very cool stuff. So before we get into the numbers, Mark, I wanted you to talk a little bit about your new role and some of the new projects at the Pew Research Center.
Well, Vicki, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and I'm looking forward to our conversation tonight. I think there's a lot of really good things to talk about, a lot of really interesting things, and a lot of really troubling things as well. So the work at the center, the work that I'm leading at the center these days, and it's about to change tomorrow with the publication of a report looking at the characteristics of the nation's Black population and its diversity, how diverse that population is in and of itself. But we are now launching a new program, a new initiative called the Race and Ethnicity Research Program. I will be the Director of Race and Ethnicity Research, and this will include a look at not only continuing our work on U.S. Latinos, which we've had over 15 years worth of an in-depth looking at and work on the nation's Hispanics, but also taking a look at Black Americans, Asian Americans, mixed race Americans, and many other groups as well, all to tell the story about race and ethnicity from a number of different perspectives and in a number of different ways. So to give you a preview about the report on Black Americans. We are looking not only at single race, non-Hispanic Blacks, which is what most people oftentimes think of when they think of the Black population, but also people who say they're multiracial and people who say that they're Afro-Latino. This is also two groups that are part of this broader population, but it's these sorts of stories, the diversity within the group, that we want to take a look at more so across a number of different parts of the US population.
Well, Mark, I look forward to having you back as the new studies that you're working on, the new projects develop, because we are a truly multiracial country, as we're going to be seeing in some of the data that you put forward. Texas being one of the states where that is ground zero, where we have really seen a diversification. We've always been a diverse state, but especially in our metro urban areas. So Mark, with that, I will give you the virtual Zoom floor. I know you put together some fantastic slides for us to get the conversation started, and then we'll go from there. But before I do hand it off to you, I want to remind folks to drop any questions that they may have in the Q&A function over here. We know the drill. We've been doing Zoom enough to know all of this. So with that, Mark, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you very much. And it's, again, a real pleasure to be here. I have a short presentation. I want to share some facts, some public opinion findings, and a little bit more about what's happening in the nation, both today and sort of in the long run. The work that I'm going to share with you is all from the Pew Research Center. And first, a little bit about who we are. We are a organization based in Washington, D.C. We are nonpartisan and non-advocacy. We're a nonprofit organization, and in fact, we call ourselves a fact tank as opposed to a think tank. And that's on purpose, because if you look at any of our reports, you will not see recommendations for the president or Congress or the governor. And that is on purpose. Our role is not to make policy recommendations. Our role is just to understand the nation's public opinion landscape, but also its demographics, how it's changing, its economics, and so much more. And actually, we do that for the world as well. So with that said, let me get going and show you a few important slides. First, demography. As you know, the nation's population has been changing over the course of the last 50 years. It's really turned into a multiracial and multi-ethnic nation in a way that it has never been before. In the last 10 years alone, the nation's population has grown, and you should know that about half of that population growth has come from US Latinos. So Latino population growth alone is driving national population growth. And that's been the case for a couple of decades now. That's interesting because when you think about the nation overall, of course, the nation's white non-Hispanic population is much larger. But as you can see in this chart, over the course of the last 10 years, the nation's white non-Hispanic population has actually not grown. It stayed about the same. Meantime, the Hispanic population added almost 10 million people. The nation's Asian American population added another 4 million people. Black Americans added another 3 million people. And all these groups together have grown much more quickly than the nation's white population. As a result, the shares of the population that are Hispanic, for example, or Asian American or Black American, those numbers are changing. For example, today about 18.5% of the nation's population are Hispanic, but that's up from maybe about 13% or so back in the early 2000s. So not only are the numbers growing and are driving population growth, but they're also changing the composition of the nation's population. Now, one of the interesting things I should say about these findings are that a lot of the growth for the nation's Hispanic population is coming from births of Hispanics to Hispanic parents in the United States. So births have mattered more than new immigrant arrivals for Hispanic population growth. By contrast, for Asian Americans, more growth is coming from the arrival of immigrants from other countries than from births in the United States. So there's two different stories driving these population growth stories for Asians and Latinos, something important to keep in mind as we talk about the population. So let's talk a little bit about some COVID impacts, because COVID has had some impacts on both Latinos and also on Asian Americans. So first, when you talk about the health impacts, and just for somebody's own health, or knowing somebody who's been sick or who passed away due to COVID-19, the impact on Latinos has been greater for the most part than it has been on others. For example, 1/3 of Latino adults in our recent survey from last month tell us that they've tested positive for COVID-19, or they're pretty sure they had it, but they hadn't been tested. By comparison, only 20% of Asian Americans say the same. And by the way, that's English-speaking Asian Americans. The sample is from a public opinion survey, and we're only able to capture English-speaking Asian Americans. And about a quarter of all adults overall. When you take a look at it by personally knowing somebody who has gotten ill with COVID-19 or who has passed away due to COVID-19, 3/4 of Latino adults tell us that that's true about them. 78% of Black Americans say that, and about 64% of white Americans and 59% of Asian Americans say the same. So there is some difference here, but these numbers have been steadily rising throughout the pandemic, as you might expect, as more and more people are touched in their personal lives by somebody who's been sick, or even they themselves have gotten sick. Now, we've also had a large economic impact on those who, I'm sorry, we had a large economic impact on Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, and basically the whole country as a result of COVID-19. This is due to the economic slowdown, the shutdown, and many other aspects of it. But one notable thing here is Latinos are more likely to live in a household that's been economically impacted by the pandemic. 58% tell us that either somebody in their household has been laid off or lost a job or had to take a pay cut due to the coronavirus outbreak. That's higher than it is for Black Americans at 41%, white Americans at 40%. For Asian Americans, the number is about 54%, so it's similar to Latinos. But as you can see, there is a somewhat differential impact of the economic consequences of the coronavirus outbreak on different groups of the US population, with Latinos more likely to live in a household where something has happened. Now, interestingly, the unemployment rate for Latinos spiked in April and May to almost 20%. For Hispanic women, it was almost 25%. Listen to those numbers. Those numbers are huge when you think about it. The overall national unemployment rate also shot up from about 4 or 5% to maybe 13, 14%. But Latinos had a much larger increase, and it went higher for Hispanic women than any other major racial or gender group. That's important to keep in mind when we think about the impact of the coronavirus outbreak and the economic downturn. Now, another thing that we wanted to track as well was the experience people have with regards to, and the thoughts they have with regards to racist and racially insensitive views being expressed. Is it more common to hear them or less common to hear them as a result of the coronavirus outbreak? Now, this is a question we asked focused on whether or not the survey respondents thought that this was true about Asians, this was true about comments about Black Americans, about white Americans, and about Hispanic Americans. And as you can see, this survey, which is from June of last year, so June of 2020, we found that among the American public, 39% said it was more common for people, for Americans to express racially or insensitive views towards Asian people. That's interesting when you take a look at these numbers compared to every other group. So there's sort of a sense that it's become more common, at least in 2020, as a result of the coronavirus outbreak, for racially and racist insensitive comments and views to be expressed publicly. Now, we also asked about what happened to people. Have they actually also had some particular experiences? This too is from the June 2020 survey that we did. And we asked about a number of different experiences. And this shows you the experiences for different racial and ethnic groups in our survey. You can see that, for example, 39% of Asians and 38% of Blacks at the time said that people had acted as if they were uncomfortable around them. When you take a look at being subject to slurs and jokes, 31% of Asians at the time said that that was something that had happened to them, and they attributed it to the coronavirus outbreak. What about fearing that somebody might threaten or physically attack them? 1/4 of Asian adults in our sample said that that is something that had happened to them because of their race and ethnicity since the coronavirus outbreak. So some interesting and important patterns in terms of experiences with the public and with others that seem to be particularly more common among Asian Americans, but Black Americans as well. Note the findings for Hispanic Americans. There's a somewhat of a mixed set of findings here in terms of experiences in June. 27% of Hispanic Americans said that somebody had acted as if they were uncomfortable around them because of their race or ethnicity since the coronavirus outbreak. But 15% said that they'd been subject to slurs or jokes, and 10% said that they feared someone might threaten or physically attack them. So there is a somewhat different pattern and extent of experiences, though here too, you do see a number of experiences that Latinos have had. Prior to the pandemic, we had done a survey of US Hispanics asking about experiences back in 2018. If you remember, in 2018, there was a lot of conversation about the experiences many Latinos were having in public, where folks were telling them to stop speaking Spanish in public, go back to your home country. People were subject to racial slurs, and this was partly tied to President Trump's then comments about Mexican immigrants and the continued push against immigration from Mexico and other Latin American countries. So it is, a lot of this is not new. Some of this was already happening to Latinos and other groups, frankly, prior to the coronavirus outbreak. But for Asian Americans, it seems that there is perhaps a more of an impact of the coronavirus outbreak on the experiences they have, particularly tied to their racial and ethnic backgrounds. This is something, by the way, that we're looking to explore in a new survey, so stay tuned for some updated findings to see if any of these findings here have changed since June of 2020. What were others perhaps worried about catching, were they worried that others might be suspicious of them if they wore a mask in public? And you could see here that 42% of Black adults and 36% of Asian adults at the time said yes. They thought that others were worried around them, or maybe have expressed some concern about them because that survey respondent was wearing a mask in public. Not sure this is as relevant today, but at the time, this was something that many folks were talking about in June of 2020, wanted to ask whether or not folks had actually experienced something around this back then. Now, we also just recently completed a survey in which we asked US adults about the amount of discrimination that different groups face in the country today. So this is a brand new assessment that we just released this maybe about a week ago. And you can see that in March of earlier this month, among all Americans, 80% said that Black people in the United States faced a lot or some discrimination today. Among 78% say Muslims experience a lot or some discrimination in our society today. And you can see there are other groups here. For Hispanic people, 76%, Asian people, 70%. But notice some of the differences in assessments between Republicans and Democrats. 63% of Republicans say that Black people in the United States face a lot or some discrimination today in our society, but 93% of Democrats, or people who lean Democrat, say the same. So Democrats generally are more likely to say that these groups that we asked about are facing more discrimination than Republicans are, but not on every group. Evangelical Christians, white people, and men, Republicans are more likely to say that those groups face a lot or some discrimination in our society today, and Democrats are less likely to say the same. So some interesting patterns here in terms of how the public perceives discrimination experienced by various groups of Americans. In addition, after the 2020 election, we asked the US public about whether or not how they feel about the state of the country. Do they feel angry? Do they feel hopeful? And we had asked it also in the middle of the year, in June of 2020. And you can see here that Latinos and Black Americans have grown more hopeful in their assessments for the state of the country. Now, this is as of November 2020. I wonder what we would get if we did it again today. But you can see that there was a turnaround in views about the state of the country among some groups of Americans. Now, white Americans too had a shift in views. They were less angry and perhaps even more hopeful. But you can see that the nation's attitudes have shifted some after the 2020 presidential election. And when you think about looking forward, one of the big questions has been: are Hispanics, are Blacks, are they going to get the COVID-19 vaccine? Is there some hesitancy about getting the vaccine? We've been tracking this at the Pew Research Center, and as you can see, during the middle of the year, going into the election, actually, there had been a measurable decline in the share of the U.S. public that said that yes, they were going to get the COVID-19 vaccine when it became available. Today, we've seen an improvement in those shares that say they will get it or have already received the vaccine. And you can see that 70% of Hispanic adults say that they have either had it already or will get it. 61% of Black Americans say the same. And 91% of Asian Americans say that they have either already had the vaccine or they will definitely or probably get a vaccine when it becomes available to them later this year. So some interesting findings about intention to get the vaccine for COVID-19 among various groups of Americans, some of which some public leaders have expressed concern about the relatively low take-up rates in those groups. And then when we talk about other things that are happening, this has been I'd say the last 6 years have been years where practically every day there's something new going on. And it's been a time of a lot of change, a lot of news stories, a lot of events happening, everything from what we just saw happen in Georgia to, if you're following what's happening at the border, and I'm sure you are, there's been a growing number of border apprehensions. I want to be very careful here about how you describe and think about this data. It looks like in February of this year, almost 100,000 apprehensions happened at the US-Mexico border. Apprehensions is a number of events. That is, the Border Patrol registered 100,000, almost 100,000 apprehensions overall. Sometimes it was a person who they had seen before earlier in the month, so sometimes it's the same person more than once. That's why this 100,000 doesn't necessarily equal the total number of people apprehended at the border. But you can see that there's been an increase relative to where we were at the end of 2020. And particularly most of this increase is being driven by single adults. A lot of that is single men. And this, I think, speaks to the economic impact of COVID-19 outside the United States. If you look at what's happened in Mexico and in Central America, the economies in those countries have been really hit hard by the COVID-19 downturn. And many of those countries do not quite have the same safety net of support that the United States has, for example. Interestingly, we've seen a record number of remittances in 2020 from Mexican immigrants living in the United States going to Mexico. And that's interesting because the World Bank was predicting that we would see a drop in remittances worldwide after a record in 2019. But Latin America stands out as a place that had continued a record pace of remittances going to home countries in Latin America, which is a little bit different than what you see elsewhere in the world. But it only goes to show you that there was a severe and sharp economic downturn in many of these countries as a result of COVID-19, and people living here were helping those back home. Now, one other interesting thing to note, unaccompanied minor numbers are rising, family unit numbers are rising too, but look how different this current increase is compared to where we were in 2019, when it was largely families and unaccompanied minors that were driving much of the increase in numbers then. Now it's largely single adults, which is actually back to where many of these patterns of arrivals and apprehensions at the border had been back in the early 2000s. But I wanted to share this with you because immigration has also emerged as not only a policy issue that people are now talking about, but a number of events are also happening, which are driving part of the conversation about immigration. I'm going to stop there because that's a lot of stuff. You can find all of our work at pewresearch.org. And if you want to, you can always reach out to me. I'm available here. And of course, would be happy to answer any questions that you may have. Tanya is our communications manager, and she can answer questions as well. Thank you for the opportunity to speak to you, and I look forward to your questions and talking a little bit more about some of the demographic change happening in our country.
Mark, this is so much. I'm like a kid in a candy store. What I did want to do is just for a second, dig into some of the subgroup details of both Hispanics and Asian Americans. We tend to think, oh, Mexico has traditionally been the largest sending country. Immigration is about Mexico. But first, if you can unpack where immigration is coming from now as compared to in the past, and then who those groups are within both of those primary sending areas.
Great question. Well, first, how many immigrants are there in the United States? So among the 330 million people or so who live in the country, 45 million are immigrants. That is people born in another country now living here. That makes up about 13, almost 14% of the US population, and it's approaching a historic record. So we're almost at the historic high, which was 14.8% in 1890. So we're getting there. Mexican immigrants make up about a quarter of the total 45 million people. There's about 11 million Mexican immigrants in the United States today. But many of those immigrants have been here for a long time, for 20 years or more, in fact. Many of the newest arrivals are from Asia. So now we receive, at least prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, the US was receiving more immigrants from China or from India than from Mexico. And when that shift happened in about 2007, it's been a decade, by the way, of this, it was the first time that Mexico wasn't the biggest sender in 4 decades. So to give you some sense of how big of a change this is a big change. On those apprehension numbers that I was showing with you, in the last 10 years, oftentimes Mexico has not been the largest country with apprehensions, or it accounted for less than half. Traditionally, it had been more than half, but Central America recently, in 2019, surpassed Mexico in terms of the number of apprehensions. That's an indicator for flows across the border. But yes, this is a major change. One little other side note, I'm not sure if the audience knows this or not, but the US has more immigrants than any other country in the world. In fact, we have about 20% of all the world's migrants live in the United States. We actually even have more migrants just from Mexico than most countries even have immigrants overall. So that also just gives you a sense of how big these numbers are. Finally, when you take a look at our share of foreign-born, for almost 14%, that's kind of in the middle tier, but other countries like the United Arab Emirates have about 88% or 80% plus of their population was born in another country. So the US is kind of in the middle when it comes to population share, which I think we have to look at as well. We can't just look at the level, we have to look at the whole story. So.
And actually this semester, Mark, I'm teaching my graduate immigration seminar, and the first week of class, you know, the required reading are all of the reports that you all put out in terms of the kind of like, what are the trends? What is the landscape? What are the numbers relative to the rest of the world? Because to really understand US immigration is looking at it in context. Now, once we're looking at the immigrants here, can you tell us a little bit about where they're settling? Because we tend to think of the Texas, the Californias, the Floridas, but we've seen some interesting things happen in the last 2 decades, in fact.
That's right. The story about immigrant population settlements has been really one of dispersion, meaning that the population has dispersed across the country. Yes, California still has a large foreign-born population, perhaps the largest of any state. Texas isn't far behind, and Texas perhaps is growing more than California. But when you take a look at where new settlement is happening, the South, particularly Georgia, has been a destination for Mexican immigrants, for immigrants from Asia, immigrants from Africa as well. So it has been a destination for many immigrants from many parts of the world. And Georgia hadn't traditionally 20 years ago been a destination for migrants. The same can be said about North Carolina, about Alabama. Also, the upper Midwest is another destination. Part of it had been refugee resettlement around Minneapolis. But when you take a look at places like Nebraska, you see the creation of, in recent decades, communities of Central Americans, Salvadorans, or Mexicans who are perhaps migrant farm workers or working in meat packing in places like Omaha or are in Eastern Washington State. But if you'll notice, I'm talking about places that aren't necessarily the traditional immigrant destinations like New York City or Miami or Los Angeles or Houston. Those are all important places still. But the world has changed. We have a growing foreign-born share in many corners, if not every corner of the country. And that's really a change from where we were 50 years ago.
And Mark, in looking at the Asian population in particular, is it China that's the main sending country? What are you seeing there?
I wouldn't say that it's the main sending country, but it's a country that has the largest number of new immigrant arrivals, but they don't make up a little more than half of the number of new arrivals from Asia. But right behind China is India. So China and India are by far the 2 biggest ones. And when you look at the 10 largest immigrant populations in the US, they are Mexico, followed by China, and then India. And then I'm not sure if you can start to see a pattern here. The other countries are El Salvador, Cuba, Korea, Vietnam. I know I'm missing some. So I'm missing 3, and I can't remember. Guatemala. I can't remember that. So there's 2 more.
Honduras.
Honduras, I think, is one of them. Yes.
Okay.
But the point being that 5 are Asian from Asia, and 5 are from Latin America. So the 10 largest immigrant groups, which account for more than half of the foreign-born population of the country, are from either Asia or from Latin America. And I think that's really a sign of how much the immigrant population in the US has changed and how much that has influenced demographic change in the country. One other data point, because if you ever go have cocktails with me, I'm just going to talk about data. Do you know how many people have arrived in the United States since 1965 as immigrants? 59 million. We estimate that 59 million people have come to the US since 1965. Not everybody stayed. Some people have gone home. Also, some people have passed away here. But 59 million is our estimate of the size of this wave of immigration, which has reshaped the demography of the country.
So we just got a comment from a colleague, a friend of ours, Dr. Melissa Michelson out in California, who says, how bad do I wish I was having cocktails with Mark right now and talking about data? Melissa, right back at you one of these days. Melissa, we miss you. The final census numbers aren't being released yet, but so I don't know if we can speak to this, Mark, about your sense of where we're going to see seats that are clawed away and what states are going to get seats. We've heard a lot of rumors about Texas getting 2 seats, California potentially losing a seat. I don't know if that is going to work out, but if you could kind of speak to what you're seeing on your end from the demographic trends, the Pew data as to what the redistricting map is likely going to look like.
So it does remain to be seen where we'll be because, as you said, the Census Bureau is delayed in their releases of reapportionment data, and also even the racial and ethnic population counts for the country. That will not be until later on in the year. But it looks like California might be on the verge of losing a congressional seat, or at the very least not growing. Georgia is likely to benefit, as is Florida, Texas as well, as you mentioned. So you do see this somewhat shifting pattern as the nation's population, frankly, has shifted. A lot of folks have moved to the Sun Belt or the South, and Georgia is one of those states that has really grown fast and in every dimension you can think of, not just because of Hispanics and immigration and Asian Americans, but its population has grown because, economically speaking, there's been a lot of activity in Georgia over the last 10 years. So I do think you will see the states like New York and Illinois potentially losing seats, and a state like California probably staying static, but then states like Texas and Florida and Georgia seeing a larger number of representatives in Congress. So I'm interested to see how this will all play out, but it's going to be a very, very interesting conversation when we see what happens, particularly around places like California.
There will be some interesting map drawing going on that I am putting money on. Yes. Now, Mark, I don't know if you can speak to this, if the Pew public opinion surveys go into the details about what it is that maybe fuels anti-immigrant sentiment from different groups. Namely, is it just dislike of the other, there are too many people coming in, or my jobs are at risk, or is it crime? So we know that Americans weren't feeling too hopeful during the last part of the year for many reasons, but even so, we've seen immigration kind of push people to have this negative affect. Do you have a sense of that, Mark?
Well, first, what's happening over the long haul? We have seen American opinions about the benefits of immigration change, literally flip. So back in the 1990s, Americans were more, 2/3 of American adults would have said immigrants are a burden on our country because they take jobs, housing, and healthcare. And maybe a third would have said they're a strength because of their hard work and talents. Today, though, or at least the most recent read from us in 2019, before the pandemic, had flipped those numbers entirely. Americans were, 2/3 were saying immigrants strengthen the country, while 1/3 said they were a burden. It had been a very gradual change. It had happened over the decades. It wasn't sudden, although during the Trump years, Democrats really grew in the share that said immigrants strengthen the country. Maybe that may have been a little bit about not only immigrants and the views of immigrants that Democrats have, but it could also have been in reaction to some of the policies that the Trump administration had enacted. At the same time, though, in the pandemic, we did ask some surveys about, do Americans favor, for example, a pathway to citizenship for those who are in the country without authorization? The vast majority of American adults do, over 75% do, including a majority of Republicans. What about support for DACA, something like Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals or for Dreamers? There too, strong support for a program like that among Americans overall. So I think you'll find there is strong support for immigrants, and its shift in the view that immigrants are generally seen as a strength or something good for the country. But it's not 100% uniform the public's not uniform in those views. Some Americans do say that in our surveys that immigrants create crime, or having a larger foreign-born population leads to more crime. But at the same time, they're more likely to say, for example, that immigrants make America better because the diversity in food and culture. So there's a little bit of an interesting story here of like, well, folks are causing crime, maybe even taking jobs, but the food and the culture impacts are really great. Now, this was a survey we did back in 2015, and we asked about science and technology, for example, as well. And the public was generally split about whether or not immigrants had a positive or negative effect on that. I think that where people are from and how they enter the country tends to drive a lot of opinions, I think, about immigrants. Many, and some immigrants as well, many who came into the U.S. and came through legal channels, oftentimes have very strong opinions about those who haven't done so. And so you do see a divide within the foreign-born population about, well, I did it the right way, why do they get a break, is some of the sentiment that you'll hear sometimes. So quite a diversity of viewpoints. I would also say that the US public is grown more the view that diversity in our population is something that makes the country stronger. So a growing share of Americans, even before the pandemic, were of that point of view, despite the challenges that we're facing and the conversation we're having and the racial reckoning that's happening across the country. Americans generally see diversity as a good thing for the country.
And Mark, I want to dig a little bit deeper into the variance in immigration opinion among immigrants themselves, because I think there is usually this assumption that all Latinos are for more expansive immigration, that it's 100% issue. And while, a good chunk of Latinos, a healthy majority of them do, that's not necessarily the case, just as not all Latinos are going to be for a path to citizenship. So can you walk us through kind of the devil in the details of those numbers?
Yeah, it's a great question, because you're absolutely right that the issue of immigration, while it might resonate with the Hispanic public more than the general US public, it oftentimes, at least in our surveys at Pew Research, hasn't resonated or hasn't been the top issue, either as a question about how people might vote in an upcoming election, or what was the most important issue to their vote in the upcoming election, whatever that might be, or how they see it as a priority for a new Congress or a new president to address. So even in 2020, we found that the issues that Latinos pointed to as most important for the Biden administration and the new Congress to address were around unemployment, the coronavirus outbreak, racial and ethnic inequality. Those were health insurance. Those were the top four issues, which were also the case for the general public. Immigration was way far down the list, generally speaking, for every major group of Americans. And that kind of reflects what we've generally found. So that's one devil in the details. I think one other part of this is that among third and higher generation Hispanics, particularly Mexican Americans in the Southwest, there are some strong opinions about unauthorized immigration. In 2010, when we did a survey asking about what should be done about those who are in the country without authorization, should they be deported? Should they be allowed to stay? Should they be allowed to stay if they pay penalties? We found that about 15% of Latino adults at the time said that they should be deported. So there is not a uniform opinion. There's some pretty strong points of view on both sides of the aisle around immigration. Couple that as well with the ways in which different groups of immigrants from Latin America have pathways to the United States. Particularly Cubans have had, up until recently, a unique pathway to entry into the United States. That sets them apart from others. It's not the case as much anymore, but it is something that would create some divisions within the population. Cubans aren't necessarily, in our focus groups, wouldn't necessarily say that they were as concerned about what was happening to Mexicans. You might hear somebody say, oh, it's a shame what's happening to Mexican Americans or Mexican immigrants, but that's not us. And that sentiment is something that you see throughout the Latino population, at least in the focus groups we've conducted at Pew Research.
So, Mark, I want to get to one question that we have here from Donald Baldovin, but I want to preface it because it's a question about identity. You know, our identity categories, why do we use them? What's the purpose? But first, I know that the Pew has found some really interesting findings on the terminology of Latino, Hispanic, Latinx. So before getting into, you know, does Hispanic, Black, White make sense? Let's talk about the Latino issue going on about what we should call ourselves or not.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question. When I think about the data that's available to us from the Census Bureau, I always have to remind myself that this data is based off of self-reports. People self-identify to be part of a group. Now, people might use different labels, but it's very interesting that we have 61 million people self-identify as part of the Hispanic or Latino, or it's not part of the census forms, but Latinx community is another way to think about it. And as you know, there's oftentimes a lot of debate about Hispanic or Latino or Latinx, which should we use? And that comes from internally. So people are oftentimes talking about that internally. And also those who are not necessarily as familiar with the population, you might get asked, I mean, I'm an expert on this, so I get asked, so what should I use? What should be the right term to describe this group? Interestingly, most folks in this group kind of shrug their shoulders when you talk about these labels. We as academics, as scholars, as people who are focused on this, use these as a way to describe the population. And we can sometimes get people can get very worked up about Hispanic versus Latino versus Latinx. It can be very, very contentious. But at the same time, the public itself says they have no preference largely for either Hispanic or Latino. And we just did a survey in 2019 asking about awareness of Latinx. Have people even heard of the term? So we didn't even ask what do they think about it, just have they heard of it? And 3/4 of Hispanic adults told us that no, they'd never heard of the term Latinx. And yet Latinx is used by celebrities, corporations, it's used by the news media, it's used by universities. It's become this term that maybe even non-Latinos use a lot to describe the population. And there's a number of reasons for that. But the population it's meant to describe generally is unaware of the term, which I think says a lot about how well these pan-ethnic labels work. What do people prefer? We find that people prefer their country of origin terms. They want to identify with their ancestry. That's generally what people first and foremost want to use, at least if they're going to use something. But the context in which the question is asked about your identity can matter a lot. If it's somebody who's not from the United States asking you this, if it's a European, you might find many Latinos will say, I'm American. If it's a Latino to Latino, you might find somebody says, well, I'm Dominican or I'm Mexican. And if it's a non-Latino to a Latino in the United States, you might hear one of the pan-ethnic terms used. But the context does matter a lot in determining which terms people will use.
And here in Texas, Mark, you know, it's Tejano, right? You're not Mexican American or Latino or Latinx. It's Tejano, which I learned being a Texan by marriage. I've learned about this. So let me use that as a segue to get to Donald's question, which is, you know, are these categories permanent here to stay, or will there be a recognition that people are just people and not segregating folks into these silos based on racial and ethnic groups? Also, just considering race and ethnicity as diversity and inclusion metrics. What about beliefs and viewpoints, conservative, liberal, libertarian? So just kind of like, you know, a complete reconceptualization is what's the talk among demographers and public opinion folks on this?
Well, the Census Bureau has over 100 years of reworking its race question. So the nation, how it sees itself, has changed over time. And that is reflected in the way in which the Census Bureau does ask about identity. So that is something that's really interesting. If you want to see something, we have a really great interactive that shows you how the question about race and ethnicity has changed since the 1790s. It's really striking how much terms come and go. What's popular for one decade may be unpopular in another. And really Hispanic or Latino was a reflection of what becomes popular or what doesn't. Hispanic was popular in the 70s and 80s, and Latino in the 90s, and then Latinx more recently. So these terms do seem to come and go, and you see it reflected in the Census Bureau. But the Census Bureau's form, and the 2020 census as an example, also is not necessarily changing in time with how the public sees itself. It takes a little bit of time for those changes to happen, because the public does change how it describes itself, how it sees itself. What I see happening is a recognition that there is intersectionality, that somebody is not just one identity. You're not just Hispanic. You're Hispanic who could be white or Black, or you could be Afro-Latino, or you could also be multiracial Hispanic with Native American heritage. So I find much of the public wants to identify all the different identities that they have and all the different ways that they're proud of it, to talk to you about it. And I think it seems to me to be a shift that I'm noticing from 20 years ago, when it was really about these mutually exclusive groups. But we as scholars, we as researchers, tend to like the mutually exclusive groups. I don't think that really reflects how the population sees itself. So what are we doing at Pew Research? Well, the new race ethnicity program that we're launching, one of the things that we're doing is, for example, for the Black American population, we're taking a broad view of what defines that population. It's not just people who say they're Black and nothing else and are non-Hispanic. So you might call that the single race non-Hispanic Black population. Traditionally, that's the group that we analyze. But when you look at the broader population, there are multiracial people who have Black as part of a Black racial identity as part of their multiracial identity. There are Hispanics who also say that they're Black. That is a broader population that I think is important to recognize. So we at the center are now doing more analysis of these larger populations, and in the language of the Census Bureau, it's Black alone or in combination, Asian alone or in combination, mm-hmm. And of course Hispanics could be any race. But recognizing that, I think it's more at really the way the public sees itself. And I want to, one last thing I want to say about this is, whenever you talk about identity, I think it's important to let people tell you what they are. And that means that you don't want to assign something or assume something. And I'll also say that sometimes in the past, when I've gotten most in trouble making assumptions about people's identity, it was in Texas, of all places. And that was because
I'm not surprised, Mark. It's Texas.
I might call somebody Chicano, and that's a Southern California thing, and that's okay. But it at the time it really reflected a Southern California name, and many Mexican Americans or Tejanos in Texas don't identify that way. But again, it gets back to this point of you got to let people tell you what they are, and eventually if they want to, they'll share with you their identity. That's the way I try to operate, and the way we do our research work at Pew Research is in our surveys, we let people self-identify and choose how they choose to identify.
And Mark, I wanted to underscore the great assets that the Pew Research Center has for this interactive learning. You mentioned the kind of infographic, the tracking of how the census has treated race throughout the centuries. I am such a fan of the mini immigration course that the Pew Research Center does. It's open to anyone. It's just a little modular set. I invite folks on this webinar to check it out, tell your friends about it. And I think you were telling me earlier, Mark, that Pew also does a number of these other kind of mini short courses for people who want to learn more, but they don't have a whole semester to go and learn about it.
So yes, thank you for bringing this up. We have these wonderful courses called email courses that you can sign up for, and you'll receive 5 emails that are meant to be read. They're easily read. So if you're on a train or you're looking for something a quick read, these are really short but very informative and data-filled emails with details about various topics. At the moment, we have 3. We have one on immigration that you mentioned. We also have one on the census in the United States. So how has the U.S. conducted censuses over time, and how is it asked about various things in the census? That's one of our email courses. And then we have one on Islam around the world, which looks at a lot of our demography and a lot of our surveys about Muslim populations in various countries. This is a great example of how this can be international as well, not just about the United States. So I encourage you to look at these. We have other ones coming, including one about politics sometime soon.
So we have Wendy already asking, can you put the link in the chat? So we'll find out right now, Wendy. But I want to end on this question, going back to immigration, Mark, because Gloria says, do you think the media plays a big part in making immigration seem as it's a negative problem, that it's a problem because what you just put forward in the data it's not 100% support of more expansionary immigration, but 2/3 is still 2/3. So do you feel that the media narrative has completely diverted from the numbers that you see day to day?
I find that a lot of the attention, and I wouldn't say it's just about the media narrative, but it's attention from even survey respondents in our work, is oftentimes on what some might characterize as what I call unauthorized immigration or illegal immigration or illegal immigrants or undocumented immigrants. That part of the migration story is the one that you find most of the public focuses on, people who are in the country without authorization. It's important to note that they make up maybe about 22, 23% of that 45 million. So most immigrants in the United States are here legally. Most are, about half are US citizens, by the way. They've naturalized to become US citizens. But oftentimes I find the focus is on those who are undocumented. And that perhaps makes some sense because that's where some of the policy questions are. That perhaps makes some sense because these are people who have perhaps challenges in living wherever they live, depending on policies in those places. So it's understandable that might be the focus. But the question about the role of the media is not a uniquely US story. It's something that you see about the role of the media and immigration in Europe. You'll see it in Asia. And it's a really interesting conversation to have when you're in a country, when you're in Africa, thinking about migration. And the characterization is that, for example, African migrants are largely going to Europe and are going to overwhelm Europe. That's one of the stories you might hear some folks talk about. However, most migrants from Africa are migrating to neighboring countries within Africa, and many countries within Africa have done a lot to create a system to allow people to move across borders in order to work. So there is systems emerging and visa programs emerging that make it easy for people to move from place to place in order to pursue employment opportunities. Now that story, the second story I just told you, is the one that we don't hear as much about. We hear about people crossing the Mediterranean and heading towards Europe. So it is striking. I think that a lot of the focus is always on the pressure points or the pain points. And that's true of the news media, and that's true of the public's attention as well.
And if I could add my 2 cents, Mark, as we're digging into this in my classes, also understanding that historically immigration is something that really stokes strong passions. Going back to the immigration of the Germans and the negative sentiment of Ben Franklin toward German immigrants, to Irish immigrants, Italian immigrants, through Ellis Island, Chinese coming to this country. So regrettably, that fear, that hesitation about people who are different, who are coming, perhaps some economic vulnerability. If you look at headlines, if you look at cartoons from the 1800s, from the 1900s, you see a lot of the same messaging that you do today. Obviously, in a different format. You don't see it in Twitter, but the essence is still there.
I'm sorry. I was going to say it's a striking point, and it's important to make. And when you think about even like the history of bilingual education, there were laws passed in many states to prevent German communities from having schools only in German, because that's what many people wanted for their children. And yet it is a story that is repeated today when it comes to Spanish in the schools. So a very, very striking story that's repeating what we've seen before.
Old wine in new bottles is how I say. We're almost at the close of the hour. And what I wanted to do was first of all, thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Mark. This was the end of the Latino lecture series. I am very hopeful that we will be able to resurrect the Latino lecture series in the fall, and hopefully in person, or if not, a hybrid version of that. I encourage you to check out the resources that we have at the LBJ School. We have all of the videos here, along with resources that our different speakers and experts have provided us. The Pew Center, I am just a groupie of your research. You guys have phenomenal resources. I dropped in a couple of links to the email courses for folks who are interested in that. And the last thing I'm going to leave you with is, if you find yourself in Washington, D.C., go to the Jefferson Hotel and order a Lopez, all right? So what Mark said about, talking data over cocktails, he's serious about this. The bartenders at the Jefferson created drinks in honor of him. So I think that's a great way to end the Latino lecture series. Mark,
Thank you.
and best of luck in this new leadership role and
Thank you.
with the new research agenda. We look forward to learning more about it as it unfolds.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure, and I look forward to seeing you in Washington. And of course, I look forward to any of your questions by email as well. It's been a real pleasure, Vicki. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you all. Bye-bye.